18 years ago, Darius Whitfield, a broke single black father, was walking home from work when he saw a homeless girl shivering under a bus station awning. He hesitated only a moment before making a decision that would change both their lives forever. Now he stands accused of embezzling from the $900 million empire he built from nothing, and the daughter he raised has vanished right before the emergency hearing that could end everything. Then, as the chancellor lifts her pen to sign the order that would strip him of his company forever, the courtroom doors swing open. Stick around for this one and hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Darius Whitfield was 53 years old on the morning his world started coming apart, standing in the glass-walled boardroom of the company he had built from nothing, still wearing the same style of worn canvas jacket he had worn as a young man on the docks. Whitfield Harbor and Rail was worth nearly $900 million, now a privately held transportation empire with cold storage warehouses and private rail lines stretching across several states, and Darius owned the majority of it, outright 62% of the common shares, a number that would matter more than anyone in that room yet realized. 6 years earlier, in order to expand the business, the company had accepted a significant investment from a private equity firm called Ashcroft Equity, run by a sharp, image-conscious woman named Vivian Ashcroft, who now held 18% in preferred shares along with a seat on the board. He could feel something shifting in the room that morning, a coolness in the way certain board members avoided his eyes, a stiffness in the small talk before the meeting began. Preston Kingsley, the board's chairman, greeted him with his usual polished warmth, the same warmth he used with reporters whenever he told the story of Darius rising from poverty to build an empire. Behind that warmth, though, something felt different, and Darius could not yet name what it was, only that instinct, built over decades of reading rooms full of men who underestimated him, was telling him to pay attention. Gerald Thornberry, another longtime board member, spoke up first that morning, choosing his words with the careful politeness of a man who believed he was being reasonable rather than unfair. He suggested gently that the company's governance structure had perhaps not kept pace with its growth, that decisions were still being made too much on instinct and not enough on modern financial discipline. He never mentioned race directly, but the shape of what he meant sat underneath his words clearly enough that Darius understood exactly who he was describing. Darius let the comment pass without responding to it directly, the same way he had let 1,000 comments like it pass over the years, refusing to let bitterness curdle into something that would poison the way he treated people. He thought briefly and without warning of a rainy night more than 18 years earlier, walking home soaked to the bone from a double shift at this very harbor, when he had almost walked past a bus station without noticing a small shape huddled beneath the awning. A girl no older than 10, shaking so hard her teeth clicked together, who had asked him only one question, once help finally arrived, whether he would come back. He had come back every week for months until the adoption was finalized, and he knelt down in a courthouse hallway and pressed a small brass key into her palm, telling her that in their family nobody would ever have to stand alone in the rain again. That girl was Amara, 28 years old now, a senior associate at a law firm in Washington, D.C., 5 years into a career built on exactly the kind of promise her father had once made her. She had grown into someone who read every contract to the very last word, just as he had once taught her at their kitchen table back when he sold the company's very first truck to help cover her tuition. Elias had been only 8 years old the week Amara moved in, afraid at first that a new sister would take away what little of his father's attention remained. That fear had dissolved quickly once he noticed the way she flinched at slamming doors and hid crackers under her pillow, some deep part of her still expecting the world to take food away without warning. He had stopped seeing her as competition and started seeing her as something worth protecting, a shift that had shaped the two of them into something closer than most siblings ever managed to become. Years earlier, back when the company was still 3 second-hand trucks and a leaking warehouse, Darius had sat down with a soft-spoken attorney named Walter Bennett to set the business up properly. Near the end of that meeting, Walter had said something Darius did not fully understand at the time, that he was building something people would eventually want to take from him, and that he would need a door out that only he knew existed if anyone ever tried to use his own family against him. On Walter's advice, Darius had quietly placed a portion of his personal founding shares into a private trust bearing Amara's name, a decision he had barely thought about again in the years since. His son, Elias, now the company's director of technical operations, sat 2 seats down from him that morning, having spent months noticing small irregularities in the maintenance budgets that never quite added up. Every time he raised the discrepancies with the board, Kingsley offered a calm, reasonable explanation that closed the conversation before Elias could push further. Elias filed each explanation away without fully believing it, uncertain whether he was watching carelessness or something more deliberate, a doubt that had been quietly building for months without anywhere to go. What none of them yet knew was that Kingsley was carrying a private financial burden that had pushed him toward decisions he never would have considered a few years earlier. He had begun accepting secret payments disguised as consulting fees from a shell company connected to Ashcroft equity payments, meant to grease the wheels of a hostile takeover that would strip Darius of control and hand a majority stake to Vivian Ashcroft at a fraction of what the company was worth. He needed only one thing to make it happen: a reason serious enough to convince a court to freeze Darius's voting rights, and he had already decided exactly where he would find it. The accusation landed less than a week later, arriving with the precision of something carefully planned rather than something discovered by accident. Kingsley presented the board with documents alleging that Darius had secretly diverted company cash and assets, not his own personal shares, but actual corporate funds, into a hidden trust bearing Amara's name. The bank statements looked authentic at first glance, complete with transfer dates and signatures that matched Darius's own handwriting closely enough to convince anyone who was not looking too carefully. Word reached the press within days, and the story that emerged was not really about accounting irregularities at all. It was about a poor black mechanic who had climbed his way into wealth, and once he had power, had quietly funneled company money to the daughter he adopted off the street. Reporters who had once celebrated his rise from poverty now used that very same story as evidence of hidden motive, twisting the most tender chapter of his life into something that sounded calculated and self-serving. Darius read the first few headlines standing at his kitchen counter before sunrise coffee going cold beside him, and felt something close to grief settle into his chest, not for his reputation, but for the way a story about love had been rewritten into a story about greed. He thought about the men and women who loaded his trucks every morning, people who had never once asked him to prove himself beyond showing up and doing right by them, and he wondered how many of them would read those same headlines before they ever heard his side of it. Kingsley's real target was never really Amara or the trust at all. His goal was to convince a court to freeze Darius's voting rights just long enough for the board to force through a sale of a controlling 51% stake to Ashcroft Equity at a price far below what the company was actually worth. Once that vote passed, Darius would become a minority shareholder in the very empire he had built with his own hands, powerless to stop whatever came next. The board had scheduled an emergency hearing just over a week out, and every day that passed without a defense made the outcome look more certain. When Elias finally reached his sister by phone to warn her about what was happening, something felt wrong from the very first ring. Amara's voice was tight and rushed, and before he could finish explaining the situation, she cut him off with a message that made no sense on its own. She told him not to look for her, not to tell their father anything, and that if anyone asked, he should simply say she had walked away from the family. She asked him to trust her just this once, without asking why. Elias sat in his car outside the office for nearly 20 minutes, after that call ended, turning her words over in his mind. His sister had never spoken to him like that before, clipped and certain as if she were following a plan she could not explain out loud. He understood somewhere beneath his confusion that this was not abandonment. It felt more like a door quietly closing so that something important could happen on the other side of it, something she needed him to protect simply by staying silent. Kingsley wasted no time exploiting Amara's sudden disappearance, feeding reporters the suggestion that she had either abandoned her adoptive father in his moment of need or had already been quietly paid off by Ashcroft Equity to disappear before she could testify. Elias wanted to fight back publicly to call every reporter himself and demand they find his sister, but Darius stopped him with a steadiness that surprised even his own attorney. He reminded his son that he had never adopted Amara, so that she would one day owe him a debt to repay, and that whatever she was doing now, wherever she had gone, she was still his daughter, and he would not let anyone turn that fact into a weapon against either of them. It was in this narrow window, with his company's reputation collapsing and his daughter gone silent, that Kingsley made Darius an offer disguised as mercy. Speaking on behalf of the board, Kingsley proposed that Darius resign, quietly accept a substantial severance package, and retain a modest 20% minority stake in exchange for signing a permanent confidentiality agreement that would bury any mention of the trust or Amara's role in it forever. It was on paper the safest way out for a man his age with a family to protect a way to walk away wealthy and untouched by scandal. Darius refused. Instead, he made a choice that carried a far heavier personal cost, one that had nothing to do with signatures on a settlement and everything to do with the men and women who depended on him for their paychecks. He used a significant portion of his own personal shares, the ones held entirely outside the protected trust, as collateral for an emergency loan large enough to keep payroll running and operations moving in case the company's accounts were frozen before the hearing concluded. If he lost this fight, he would not simply lose the company. He would lose the shares he had pledged as well, a personal financial collapse layered directly on top of a professional one. Standing in his office that evening, staring out at the rows of trucks lined up along the dock he used to work as a young man, Darius understood exactly what he was risking. He had spent 18 years building something meant to protect people who had never had anyone protect them, and now that very same purpose was asking him to risk everything he personally owned to buy his company a few more days. He thought of the key he had once placed in a frightened child's palm, and of the promise he had made that nobody in his family would ever stand alone in the rain again. Whatever came next, he intended to keep that promise, even if it cost him everything he had built to make it possible. The days after Darius signed away a piece of his own personal wealth to keep the company breathing felt different from any hardship he had faced before. Poverty, he had always told himself, was something he understood, something he had already survived once and could survive again if it came to that. What kept him awake now was not the fear of losing money, but the fear of watching something built on trust get twisted into a weapon against the very people who trusted him most. Word of the accusations spread through the business community faster than Darius could have imagined, and the effects showed up almost immediately. Two long-standing shipping partners quietly paused their contracts, pending the outcome of the board's internal review, citing risk exposure in language that sounded polite but landed like a slap. A regional bank that had financed the company's rail expansion 2 years earlier sent a letter requesting additional documentation before releasing the next scheduled disbursement, a request that had never come up in years of steady payments. Gerald Thornberry, still unaware of the true nature of Kingsley's motives, used the board's next scheduled call to suggest gently but firmly that Darius consider stepping aside temporarily while the allegations were resolved. He framed it as protecting the company's image rather than as an accusation of guilt, careful with his words in the way people are careful when they believe they are being reasonable rather than unfair. Darius listened to the whole call without raising his voice, though his hand gripped the edge of his desk hard enough to leave a mark. Vivian Ashcroft gave a brief interview to a regional business paper that week, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood exactly how far she could go without saying anything that could be used against her later. She said that a company approaching $1 billion in value could not be run on sentiment or on what she called rescue narratives, a phrase that made its way around the office within hours, and stung more than any direct insult could have. Darius understood immediately who and what she was really talking about. He had hired Sandra Coleman, a seasoned corporate attorney out of Wilmington, with a reputation for handling complicated governance disputes the moment the accusations became public. Sandra was sharp and thorough, and she understood Delaware corporate law better than almost anyone in the state, but she had a significant gap in her defense that worried her more each day. The original trust documents that could prove Darius's innocence had been drafted by Walter Bennett years earlier and had never resurfaced since his retirement, leaving Sandra to build a defense without the one document that could settle everything. Inside the company, Elias carried a weight that nobody else could see. He held his sister's strange, urgent instructions close to his chest, replaying them over and over, while he tried to decide whether silence was loyalty or a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. At the same time, he kept circling back to the maintenance budget irregularities he had noticed months earlier, irregularities that had never been fully explained, no matter how many times he raised them. Late one evening, working alone in his office, long after the rest of the operations floor had emptied out, Elias pulled archived maintenance records going back nearly 2 years. He found gaps where entire email threads should have existed conversations about budget cuts that had clearly happened, but left almost no digital trace behind. It was not enough evidence to bring to the board on its own, but it was enough to convince him that Kingsley's fingerprints were on more than just the accusations against his father. He kept the discovery to himself for 2 more days, uncertain who he could trust inside a company suddenly full of people choosing sides. Every conversation in the break room seemed to carry a second meaning. Now colleagues who had known him for years suddenly careful about what they said in front of him, as though loyalty itself had become something people needed to calculate rather than simply feel. Elias began saving copies of everything he found onto a personal drive at home, unsure yet what he would do with it, only certain that he could not let it disappear the way the emails already had. 300 miles away in Washington, D.C. Amara was living through a different kind of storm entirely. After receiving Elias's call, she had spent a sleepless night reviewing everything she remembered about her father's business structure, searching her memory for anything Walter Bennett might have mentioned to her years earlier when she was still a law student, helping organize old family paperwork over a holiday break. She remembered faintly a conversation from nearly 10 years earlier when Walter Bennett had visited the family for dinner and mentioned almost as an aside that he had helped her father set up something meant to protect the company if it ever grew large enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. She had been a college student then, more interested in her exams than in her father's business affairs, and she had never thought to ask him what exactly that protection looked like. Now that vague memory felt like the only thread she had to pull. Amara tracked down Walter Bennett's old law office and discovered it had closed years earlier when he retired, its physical files transferred to a records management company for long-term digital storage. When she finally reached someone in that company's archive department, she learned something that made her stomach drop, that the file bearing the Whitfield name had been flagged for scheduled permanent deletion with less than 48 hours remaining before the digital backup would be wiped entirely. Desperate, she reached out to Walter's daughter, a woman she had met only briefly at family gatherings years earlier, and explained the situation as clearly and urgently as she could without revealing everything at stake. Walter's daughter, now overseeing part of her father's old client relationships, agreed to authorize emergency access to the backup files before the deletion window closed. Amara spent the better part of 2 days combing through disorganized digital scans, searching for anything with her father's handwriting on it. She found it almost by accident buried inside a folder mislabeled with an old project code from years earlier. The original Whitfield Founders Trust document sat there in scanned form, along with a handwritten letter from her father dated the same year the trust was created, addressed simply to her by name, explaining that the shares placed inside the trust were his own personal shares, set aside long before the company ever went looking for outside investment. It was never company money. It had never been company money at all. While she absorbed what she had found, a second and far more personal crisis was unfolding inside her own career. Her law firm in Washington, D.C., it turned out held a long-standing advisory relationship with Ashcroft Equity, one of its more lucrative institutional clients, and firm leadership made it clear within days that her involvement in her father's case created an unacceptable conflict of interest. She was told in a private meeting with two senior partners that if she continued pursuing anything related to the matter, her upcoming partnership consideration would be over before it began. Amara chose to continue anyway, working quietly outside of normal business hours, careful never to use firm resources or firm time for anything connected to her father's case. It did not matter. Within days, firm leadership discovered what she was doing and terminated her employment immediately, citing a breach of the very conflict policy they had warned her about. She lost her position, her reputation inside a competitive legal market, and the partnership track she had spent 5 years building, all before she had even set foot inside the courtroom that would decide her father's fate. The termination meeting lasted less than 10 minutes, conducted by two partners who had once praised her work in front of the entire firm and now spoke to her in the flattened, careful tone people use when they have already decided something and simply need to deliver it. She walked out of the building carrying a single box of belongings past desks, where colleagues suddenly found reasons not to look up, and sat in her car in the parking garage for a long while before she trusted herself to drive. She allowed herself exactly one night to grieve what she had lost sitting alone in her apartment, with the trust documents spread across her kitchen table, the same kind of table where her father had once told her never to sign anything without reading it to the very last word. She thought about calling him just to hear his voice, and decided against it, knowing that hearing what she had already given up would only make him try harder to stop her from giving up anything more. By morning, she had made her decision. She would not attempt to represent her father in court herself, both because she no longer had a firm behind her and because, as the named beneficiary connected to the trust itself, she understood all too well that serving as his attorney would create exactly the kind of conflict Kingsley's team could use to discredit everything she brought forward. Instead, she reached out directly to Sandra Coleman, introducing herself and explaining calmly and carefully exactly what she had found. She offered to appear not as counsel, but as a witness, the person named in the original trust documents as its designated protector, someone who could speak to its true purpose from first-hand knowledge. Sandra listened to everything Amara laid out and understood immediately that this changed the entire shape of their defense. There was still a missing piece, one that worried both women equally. The trust explained why Darius had done nothing wrong, but it did nothing to explain why Kingsley had manufactured false evidence in the first place, or who else might be involved. Amara believed there had to be a financial trail somewhere connecting Kingsley to Ashcroft Equity, some reason a respected board chairman would risk everything to manufacture a fraud case against the man who built the company he served. It was through an unexpected contact that the answer began to surface. Renee Castillo, Kingsley's longtime executive assistant, had spent months growing uneasy about certain messages she had been asked to forward and certain files she had been asked to quietly archive outside of normal company channels. When Amara reached out to her through a mutual contact from her earlier legal career, Renee agreed to meet, choosing a quiet coffee shop far from the company's offices, clearly nervous but resolved to finally say something. Renee arrived early and sat facing the door, her hands wrapped around a cup she never touched, glancing toward the window every few minutes as though she expected someone from the office to walk past. She told Amara she had thought about coming forward for weeks, ever since she first noticed the timing between certain messages and certain decisions that never quite made sense on their own. What finally pushed her to reach out she said was watching the news coverage twist a father's love into a headline about greed, knowing she was one of the few people who could prove it wasn't true. Renee handed over screenshots of message threads between Kingsley and Vivian Ashcroft conversations that referenced payments timing and a plan to depress the company's value before finalizing an acquisition. She explained that she had kept the images on a personal device rather than a company one specifically because she suspected, even before any accusations became public, that something about the arrangement did not sit right with the values the company claimed to hold. It was not proof of everything, but it was a thread worth pulling. Sandra used this new information to file an emergency request for financial records connected to the shell company mentioned in Renee's screenshots, a formal request submitted properly through the court rather than anything gathered through improper means. The judge, overseeing preliminary matters, approved a limited subpoena, allowing an independent forensic accountant, a former colleague of Amara's from her earliest years in practice, to trace transactions tied to the account in question. Everything that followed would be built on paperwork obtained the right way, nothing hidden, nothing that could later be challenged as improperly acquired. 8 days after the accusations first became public, the emergency hearing finally arrived at the Delaware Court of Chancery. The state's specialized venue for exactly this kind of corporate governance dispute, presided over by Chancellor Miriam Ellison, a woman known throughout the legal community for her exacting attention to documentation and her low tolerance for theatrics. Darius walked into the courtroom in a plain gray suit that still somehow looked slightly out of place among the tailored jackets filling the opposing table, flanked by Sandra Coleman, who carried herself with the calm of someone who had survived far worse rooms than this one. The gallery behind them was fuller than Darius expected dock workers and drivers who had taken the morning off without being asked, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a room that smelled faintly of polished wood and nervous energy. He did not turn around to look at them, but knowing they were there settled something in his chest that no amount of legal strategy could have managed on its own. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he was not the only one whose life would change because of it. Across the aisle sat Elliot Marsh, the lead attorney representing Kingsley, and by extension the interests aligned with Ashcroft Equity, a man whose reputation for precise, merciless cross-examination preceded him into every courtroom he entered. Vivian Ashcroft sat quietly in the gallery behind her legal team, dressed in the kind of understated elegance that made her presence feel more like a formality than genuine concern, as though the outcome of the hearing were already a foregone conclusion in her mind. Marsh opened by walking the court through what looked on the surface like an overwhelming case. He presented falsified bank statements showing transfers from company accounts into a trust bearing Amara's name, matched them against Darius's own signature on unrelated documents, and layered in the adoption records the tuition payments Darius had made years earlier, and finally pointedly the fact that Amara herself was nowhere to be found. He built his argument carefully around an unspoken assumption that a man who came from the docks could not possibly understand, let alone properly manage the complex financial instrument now bearing his daughter's name. He spoke for nearly 40 minutes, without raising his voice, laying each document on the record with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already won cases like this one before, cases where sympathy for a founder's story rarely survived contact with a stack of bank statements. Several times he let a transfer date hang in the silence of the courtroom after reading it aloud, giving its implication time to settle before moving on to the next. Sandra pushed back where she could, challenging the authenticity of certain documents and questioning the timeline of the alleged transfers. But without the original trust paperwork in hand, at that exact moment, her objections landed softer than she needed them to. Marsh pressed his advantage, and for the first time since the accusations began, Darius felt something close to real fear settle into his chest. Not for himself, but for every driver, every dock worker, every family whose paycheck depended on a company that was slipping further out of his hands with every passing minute. Chancellor Ellison, reviewing the state of the arguments before her, asked Sandra directly whether the defense had any additional witnesses or evidence to introduce before she considered the board's request. Sandra hesitated, glancing briefly toward the courtroom doors, aware that the one witness who could change everything had not yet arrived and had given no updates since the previous evening. She told the court honestly that she had nothing further to present at this time. Kingsley allowed himself a small, controlled smile from where he sat, the expression of a man who believed the hardest part was already behind him. Ashcroft adjusted the cuff of her blazer with the unhurried calm of someone confirming a transaction she considered already complete. Chancellor Ellison lifted her pen, preparing to sign the emergency order that would freeze Darius's voting rights and clear the path for a forced sale of the company he had spent 18 years building from 3 broken-down trucks and a leaking warehouse. Elias, sitting in the front row directly behind his father, stared at the courtroom doors with a tightness in his chest. He could not shake, torn between the promise he had made to protect his sister's silence and the growing terror that her plan, whatever it was, had simply run out of time. Darius kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, refusing to let the room see exactly how much he had already lost and how much more he stood to lose in the next few seconds. The pen had barely touched the paper when the courtroom doors swung open with enough force to draw every head in the room. Sandra's phone buzzed once in her hand, a message she had been waiting for without daring to hope it would come in time. Amara stood in the doorway in a dark suit, a worn leather folder held tightly against her side, 18 years of silence and 8 days of sacrifice carried in the steadiness of her expression as she stepped forward into the room that would decide her father's future and her own. The sound of the courtroom doors striking the wall still seemed to hang in the air as Amara crossed the threshold, her footsteps steady against the polished floor, despite everything trembling beneath the surface of her composure. Chancellor Ellison lowered her pen without setting it down completely, her eyes moving from the folder in Amara's hand to the faces of the attorneys now shifting in their seats. Sandra Coleman rose immediately, requesting permission to introduce an emergency witness whose testimony bore directly on the matter before the court. Elliot Marsh was on his feet, just as quickly objecting on the grounds that the witness standing in the doorway was the adoptive daughter of the defendant and the named beneficiary connected to the very trust at the center of the dispute, a relationship he argued made her testimony inherently compromised. Sandra countered that Amara was appearing solely as a fact witness with direct knowledge of the trust's origin and purpose, not as legal counsel, and that her personal connection to Darius did not disqualify her from testifying to documented facts. Chancellor Ellison considered the objection for a long moment before overruling it, noting that the court would weigh credibility itself once the testimony was heard. Amara took her place at the witness stand, setting the worn leather folder in front of her with a steadiness that did not fully match the exhaustion sitting behind her eyes. She introduced herself plainly, stating her name, her 5 years in legal practice, and her role as the designated protector of the Whitfield Founders Trust, a title she had not even fully understood the weight of until the past several days had forced her to learn it completely. Sandra walked her through the first and most important piece of evidence the court needed to see. Amara opened the folder and produced the original trust document, the one she had pulled from a digital archive scheduled for permanent deletion with less than 2 days to spare. She explained calmly and precisely that the shares placed inside the trust had always belonged to her father personally, set aside years before any outside investment ever entered the company, long before Ashcroft Equity existed as a stakeholder in Whitfield Harbor and Rail at all. Sandra entered the document into evidence alongside the handwritten letter Darius had written the same year, addressed to Amara describing exactly why he had created the trust. Marsh attempted to challenge the authenticity of the document, suggesting it could have been fabricated recently to match the current crisis. Sandra was ready for this, calling forward June Alcott, Darius's longtime legal assistant, who confirmed under oath that annual renewal filings for the trust had been submitted every single year without exception filings that existed in the court's own public record system, independent of anything Amara had brought forward that day. She testified that she had personally submitted several of those filings directly to Kingsley's office for review, a detail that visibly unsettled the opposing table. The second piece of evidence came from the financial trail Sandra had obtained through the court-ordered subpoena during the previous week. A forensic accountant called next to the stand walked the court through documentation tracing a payment from a shell company linked to Ashcroft Equity into Preston Kingsley's personal account, a transfer dated the same week he filed the initial complaint against Darius. The accountant explained the transaction in plain terms, describing how the shell company had no operational history and existed almost entirely to move that single payment. She spoke carefully, pulling up bank routing records and corporate registration filings on a screen positioned for the chancellor to see, tracing the shell company back through 2 layers of ownership until it connected directly to an entity controlled by Vivian Ashcroft. The gallery behind Darius shifted audibly. At that moment, a ripple of quiet murmurs, passing through people who had spent the last 8 days reading his name in headlines that called him a thief. Kingsley's attorney attempted to argue that the payment represented a legitimate consulting arrangement unrelated to the case at hand. The accountant responded that no consulting agreement, invoice, or scope of work had ever been filed to support that claim, and that the timing of the transfer arriving days before the fraud complaint was submitted made the explanation difficult to accept at face value. Kingsley sat rigid at the defense table, his jaw tightening as murmurs moved quietly through the gallery behind him. Sandra then turned to the third and final piece of evidence, the one Amara had been most reluctant to share, though she understood by now there was no way forward without it. Amara described without embellishment how a representative connected to Ashcroft Equity had approached her privately before the hearing, offering her a partnership position at a prestigious firm, along with a substantial payment on the sole condition that she remain absent from the proceedings entirely. She explained that she had recorded the conversation legally under Washington, D.C. law, permitting recording with the consent of one party involved, a fact Sandra confirmed for the record before the recording was played. The room fell into a heavy stillness as the recording played through the courtroom speakers, the voice of the intermediary clear enough to leave no room for misinterpretation, stating plainly that Ashcroft Equity did not need Amara to betray her father, only to stay quiet. Vivian Ashcroft's expression did not change as the recording played, though her hands folded a little more tightly in her lap, and for the first time since the hearing began, she seemed to be calculating rather than simply observing. Amara explained to the court that she had pretended to consider the offer only long enough to avoid raising suspicion, while she continued gathering the trust documents and financial records now sitting in front of the chancellor. She added, without asking for sympathy, that her decision to pursue this evidence had already cost her the position she had spent 5 years building at her law firm in Washington, since continuing to investigate her father's case after being warned off had violated the firm's conflict of interest policy. It was not a performance of sacrifice. It was simply the truth of what the last 8 days had taken from her. Marsh, sensing the momentum shifting hard against his side, changed his approach and turned his questioning toward Amara's credibility, directly asking her to recount her early years of homelessness, the fact that she had never known her birth parents, and the tuition payments Darius had made for her law school education years earlier. He suggested to the court that a woman who owed her entire adult life to the defendant could hardly be expected to testify against her own interests with any real objectivity. He pressed further, asking whether it was true that she had once been found alone outside a bus station with nothing to her name, whether it was true that the defendant had chosen her specifically because a homeless child made for a compelling story, whether her entire relationship with Darius Whitfield had in some sense always been transactional in nature. Elias shifted forward in his seat, his jaw tight, but Sandra placed a steadying hand briefly on the table in front of her, trusting Amara to answer for herself. Amara did not look away from him as she answered. She said that a debt was something a person paid in order to be free of it, but a promise was something a person kept because of who they had chosen to become, and that she was not sitting in that chair to repay any debt to her father. She told the court plainly that she had already lost her job, her firm, and the partnership she had worked toward for 5 years by the time she walked through those doors that morning, and that she had nothing left to gain from testifying except the truth being placed on the record where it belonged. With the 3 pieces of evidence now fully entered, Sandra asked the court to consider one final provision buried within the trust document itself, a clause that had sat dormant for 18 years without ever needing to be invoked. The provision stated that if the founder of the trust were ever attacked through fabricated financial allegations tied to his family allegations designed to facilitate a hostile transfer of company control, the voting authority attached to the shares inside the trust would transfer temporarily to the trust's named protector. Amara confirmed for the record that she had been named that protector at the time the trust was created, a designation her father had made before she was even old enough to understand what it meant. Chancellor Ellison took a long moment reviewing the documents laid out before her, cross-referencing the renewal filings against the court's own records and studying the forensic accountant's report page by page in silence. The courtroom waited through that silence without a single sound, Kingsley staring fixedly at the table in front of him, Ashcroft watching the chancellor with an expression that had finally lost its earlier composure, Elias gripping the edge of the bench where he sat, and Darius sitting perfectly still beside Sandra, his hands folded in his lap the way they had been since the hearing began that morning. Amara remained at the witness stand, watching the chancellor's face for any sign of what was coming, aware that everything she had given up over the past 8 days now rested entirely on a decision she could no longer influence. She thought briefly of the brass key still sitting in a small box on her dresser back in Washington, and of a promise made in a courthouse hallway when she was too young to understand what it would eventually cost either of them to keep it. When Chancellor Ellison finally spoke, her voice carried the measured weight of someone who understood exactly how much rested on every word she was about to say. She stated that based on the evidence presented, the court found sufficient grounds to issue an immediate emergency order rather than the request the board had originally brought before her. She ordered the proposed transfer of company shares to Ashcroft Equity halted immediately pending further review, and she reinstated Darius's voting rights on a temporary basis while formally recognizing Amara's standing as protector of the trust for the shares held within it. She further ordered that Preston Kingsley be suspended from his position on the board, effective immediately pending a full investigation into the financial evidence presented that day, and she directed that all documentation regarding the suspicious payment and the attempted witness interference be forwarded to the Delaware Attorney General's office for separate criminal review. She was careful to note for the record that this was an emergency protective order rather than a final judgment, and that a full hearing addressing the remaining questions would be scheduled in the coming weeks. It was not the end of the legal process, but it was enough to stop the freefall. Kingsley did not speak as the order was read, his earlier confidence gone entirely from his posture, replaced by the stillness of a man calculating just how much trouble now stood between him and whatever life he had imagined for himself. Ashcroft rose from her seat without a word once the chancellor dismissed the hearing, her attorneys already speaking in low, urgent tones as they gathered their materials, the sale she had considered finished only hours earlier now indefinitely out of reach. Behind Darius, the gallery let out a collective breath that had been held for what felt like the entire morning, dock workers reaching over to grip each other's shoulders, a few wiping their eyes without embarrassment. None of them fully understood every legal term the chancellor had used, but they understood enough that the man who had signed their paychecks for years, without ever once treating them as replaceable, was still standing at the head of the company that employed them. Outside the courtroom, in the quiet marble hallway where the noise of the hearing finally faded into ordinary echoes, Darius found Amara standing near a window, the leather folder still held loosely at her side. He admitted to her in a voice rougher than he intended that there had been moments over the past 8 days when he genuinely feared she had walked away from the family for good. Amara told him that he had taught her a long time ago that when someone sets a trap at the front door, sometimes the only way through is to find your way in from behind it. Darius asked her gently why she had never told him what she was planning, why she had let him sit through those days believing she might truly be gone. She explained that if he had known, he would have tried to protect her, and that any attempt to shield her might have alerted Kingsley that something was being built against him before it was ready, giving him time to destroy the very evidence that had just saved the company. This time she told him she needed to be the one protecting him. Elias reached them a moment later, pulling his sister into an embrace that said everything neither of them had the words for. In that hallway, a silence that carried the full weight of the message she had sent him days earlier, the one that had asked him to trust her without explanation. He understood now exactly what that trust had cost her and exactly what it had bought all of them in return. In the weeks that followed, the criminal investigation opened by the Attorney General's office moved forward steadily, building toward formal charges against Kingsley for fraud and bribery, his personal assets frozen pending the outcome. Investigators later confirmed what Rene Castillo had already suspected for months, that Kingsley's debts had grown severe enough to make him desperate long before he ever presented a single falsified document to the board. Ashcroft Equity found itself under separate financial scrutiny for its role in the attempted witness interference, ultimately forced to divest its preferred shares in the company under a negotiated settlement it had never wanted to accept. Marsh withdrew from the case entirely within days, quietly informing the court that he could no longer ethically represent his client once the extent of the fabricated evidence became clear. Gerald Thornberry, though never charged with any wrongdoing, resigned quietly from the board after an internal review of his conduct throughout the crisis made his position untenable, a resignation he offered without argument, as though some part of him had already known his assumptions about Darius had never been fair to begin with. Elias was formally recognized for the operational irregularities he had uncovered on his own, taking on an expanded role overseeing internal compliance alongside his technical duties, a responsibility he approached with the same quiet determination that had led him to keep digging in the first place. Amara, having lost her position in Washington, chose not to return to corporate law at all, opening a small practice of her own instead, and accepting a formal role as special counsel to the very trust that had once been nothing more than a stranger's quiet warning to her father years earlier. Darius, once the loan against his personal shares was repaid in full as the company stabilized, stood exactly where he had always intended to stand, holding on to everything he had built without ever needing to abandon the principles that built it. Months later, standing on the same dock where he had once worked double shifts as a young mechanic, soaked through from the rain, Darius gathered the people who depended on Whitfield Harbor and Rail for their livelihoods, and told them the story he had never fully shared before, the story of a rainy night 18 years earlier, and a child who asked him only one question. He spoke plainly the way he always had, telling them that the company they worked for had never really been built on trucks or contracts at all, but on a promise that nobody who worked for it would ever be treated as disposable. Amara stood beside him that day, and before he finished speaking, she reached into her coat and placed something small and familiar into his open palm, the same brass key he had once given her outside a courthouse when she was still a frightened child with nowhere else to go. The crowd fell quiet, sensing that whatever was passing between father and daughter in that moment belonged to them alone, even as it stood, witnessed in front of everyone who had shown up that day. She told him that he had given her that key on a day when she had no home of her own, and that she was only giving him back now the key to the empire he had built with his bare hands. Darius closed his fingers around it, the metal worn smooth from 18 years in her pocket, and slid it into the same canvas jacket that had followed him from the docks to the boardroom, and finally into a courtroom that almost took everything from him. The company remained his $900 million strong, but the truest victory of his life had nothing to do with the number attached to it and everything to do with the woman standing beside him, once a child left alone in the rain, now strong enough to stand in front of a courtroom and bring her father home. If Darius and Amara's story moved you today, remember what it was really built on. That love shown consistently in small, ordinary moments is what ends up saving people when it matters most. If you believe families are worth fighting for the way this one did, subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story like it, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. We'll see you in the next one.